mystery that cannot be explained. An enigma that defies reason. A surprising and unexpected answer. To encounter such a mystery firsthand may change your life forever. Face to face with the greatest riddles of the ages, the world's most profound mysteries reach out and touch your life in ways you never imagined possible. Extreme Mysteries.
The Bible is the oldest continuous history of any people on earth today. But is it truly history? Can we say with any degree of certainty, for example, that the miraculous stories attributed to Moses are factual? Some people seek answers in the depths of the mind. But let's see what we can learn from those who seek answers in the depths of uncharted waters. Answers that have been waiting to be discovered since Moses crossed the Red Sea. Did the power of God working through Moses open a passageway of dry land through the Red Sea? Was there, in fact, an exodus of millions of Israelite slaves out of Egypt into the deserts of Sinai? Is such a gathering and mass movement of people, goods, and livestock even possible? Can we resolve the controversy that has swirled around these stories of miraculous events for not just centuries, but millennia? After thousands of years of argument, science and archaeology now add their contribution. The answers to these questions may shock you. They will surely surprise you. Breathtaking new discoveries and mind-boggling answers are just ahead. There's an old saying among the Jews that goes, "From Moses to Moses, there is no one like Moses." The reference bridges a gap of nearly 4,000 years from the Moses of the Old Testament to the great 12th century rabbi Moses Maimonides. It is intended as an expression of the great honor and respect the Jewish people still hold for the prophet and leader who they believe brought their ancestors out of slavery in Egypt. Through Moses, they escaped the vengeance of the Pharaoh when God opened a passageway through the Red Sea. But what do we know of this man, Moses? And how did he get to such an exalted position? The Bible gives a remarkable account about the history of the man known as Moses. According to the story in the book of Exodus, the Israelites were a people that had been enslaved by Egypt and were growing in number, much to the concern of their Egyptian slave masters. Because of this, the Pharaoh ordered all male infants of the Hebrews to be slain. A young mother, one of the enslaved Israelites, could no longer protect her infant son. She put him in a basket and set him afloat on the Nile River near the palace of the Pharaoh. Pharaoh's daughter, the princess of Egypt, found the basket and took the infant to raise as her own. She called the child Moses because she said she drew him from the water. Raised in royal surroundings, it was not until Moses reached manhood that he first discovered he was an Israelite. It was then that he began to identify with his true heritage. Actually, the truth of the story of the Exodus depends on the answer to 3 questions. Did the 10 plagues summoned by Moses against Egypt actually occur? Was there really an enslaved people called the Israelites who made a great exodus out of Egypt, led by a man who received his instructions from a burning bush? And is it possible that the Red Sea really parted, as stated in the Bible? The answers to these questions will determine whether we're dealing with a miracle or a mirage. And today, there is little agreement among the experts.
Archaeology provides background information for unlocking narratives and events such as the Exodus account. In this case, the account contains sufficient place names cross-referenced in non-biblical Sumerian and Assyrian cuneiform tablets to confirm the accuracy of the Exodus account and to assure scholars that it was not an account invented for later consumption.
On the face of it, a story about a burning bush is pure fiction, or at least mythology. It smacks of pious enthusiasm. The idea that a bush can be burned and still not be consumed is just not within the realm of possibility.
The biblical story of the burning bush is completely true and totally provable.
From the burning bush to the parting of the Red Sea, the story of the Israelite exodus out of Egypt has always been a source of great controversy among the experts, in spite of, or perhaps because of, the Bible's remarkable account of the man called Moses. As Moses grew older, he began to take a deeper, more sympathetic interest in his people. But the book of Exodus implies that Moses somehow learned of his Hebrew heritage, and on one occasion, when he personally witnessed their ill treatment, his anger and resentment toward the Egyptians got the better of him, and he killed the overseer who was brutalizing a slave. Moses tried to secretly bury the Egyptian in the sand, but was found out, and had to flee to the wilderness of Midian to escape Pharaoh's sentence of death. He was befriended by Jethro, a Midianite priest, also a descendant of Abraham, through his wife Keturah. Moses married Jethro's daughter, and for 40 years he lived the simple life of a shepherd. Then, in a matter of minutes, everything in his life changed.
I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I have seen the misery of my people who are enslaved in Egypt. You, Moses, are going to go to Pharaoh and lead my people out of their bondage in Egypt.
Who am I to lead the Israelites out of Egypt? Why should Pharaoh listen to me?
Do not fear, for I shall be with you.
Moses' encounter with the burning bush is one of the most memorable stories in the Bible, and certainly one of the most controversial. We are told that not only did the bush burst into flame, but it was not consumed by the fire. The story has long been questioned by Bible critics, so we went to Israel to question the experts there on the subject.
At the foot of Mount Sinai, one finds the monastery of St. Catherine. The local story of the shepherds, the nomadic people, the Bedouins, do hold that the actual bush that is found inside the monastery is still the same bush.
I can't confirm or reject that the bush growing at the monastery was the actual burning bush, but it is a specific desert plant that fits the biblical description. It's the Fraxinella, or gas plant, Dictamnus albus, a sturdy perennial bush with white or purple flowers common in the Middle East. The bush produces an oil so volatile that it can be ignited by the sun. The oil quickly burns up, but the bush itself is not damaged.
It would appear that the story of the burning bush is not so fantastic after all. And if there is scientific evidence to support this odd biblical account, does it lend credibility to the rest of the Moses account? For example, what of the 10 plagues called down upon Egypt by Moses? It must have seemed to Moses that God was asking him to do the impossible, and at great personal risk. He was presumably still under sentence of death, and in spite of his early upbringing, to the Pharaoh, he was nothing more than an Hebrew outcast. The Pharaoh was a formidable and headstrong young man, a builder of cities and great temples, and an absolute ruler. But Moses and his brother Aaron, nevertheless, went to Pharaoh to plead for the release of his people. Each of their meetings brought about a judgment on the people of Egypt, and after each plague, Moses went to Pharaoh and asked him to let his people go, but each time Pharaoh refused. According to the Bible, each plague was more intense than the last, and for years, scholars have searched for some hint in the Egyptian writings that would point to such horrific events actually happening. But the Bible remained the only source of information about these devastating plagues until recently.
And there's an ancient Egyptian papyrus document called the Ipuwer Papyrus, and it recounts in eyewitness fashion the plague of blood, the plague of cattle disease, the plague of strange fire phenomena, the plague on the firstborn, the strange darkness, all the events that we previously thought we only knew about from the Bible. We can read about it in the Egyptian records.
Little by little, science and archaeology seem to be catching up with the biblical account. But what of the most fantastic episode of all, the parting of the Red Sea? Could it have happened? You'll be amazed at what has been discovered. The miracles of Moses are almost too many to count, and some scholars insist they're too fantastic to be believed. But many of them are not only still believed by the Jewish people, they honor them with centuries-old traditions. The Bible describes the arrival of the last plague with great drama. God instructed every Israelite to stay indoors and prepare a meal of lamb or goat. They were to take the blood of these animals and use it to place a mark over the door of their houses. On that night the Lord descended on the land of Egypt, and the firstborn of every Egyptian family was struck down in death. But the Jewish families who had marked their doorways were spared. That great miracle is still celebrated by Jewish families as the Feast of the Passover. For the Egyptians, this final plague was the most terrible. Even Pharaoh lost his beloved son. Finally, his resistance was broken, and he ordered the Israelites to be set free. But they must leave the land of the Nile completely. The Bible tells us the Lord provided a cloud cover by day and a column of fire by night to guide the Israelites through the desert. But the big question is, where did they go? According to the Bible, their destination was to be the land of Canaan. The most direct route, called the way of the land of the Philistines, would have taken them to the north, was much shorter than the southern route, and would have most likely put them on a path toward the Sea of Reeds, a shallow, marshy area at the north end of the Gulf of Suez. It is this area that many scholars have accepted as the point of crossing. But is it?
There are some major difficulties with the Sea of Reeds site as the point of crossing. First of all, if this is the point at which the Israelites entered the Red Sea, well, they're still in Egypt. However, Exodus 14:11 clearly states that they were out of Egypt. Now in this verse, the panicking Israelites understood that they were no longer in Egypt because they asked, "What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt?"
Were there no graves in Egypt, Moses, that you led us out here into the wilderness to die?
Did we not speak to you in Egypt of this? Did we not tell you to let us be?
Also, the crossing place is not a shallow Sea of Reeds or inland lake as some have affirmed. That conclusion, I believe, is pure conjecture and cannot be supported by the biblical record. The names from the Exodus account were probably inserted on maps by guesswork and cannot be located with certainty today. A more careful reading of the scriptures revealed some very interesting facts. First of all, the waters they crossed were deep, really deep. Isaiah, for example, talks about a path through the mighty waters and acknowledges that it was God who dried the sea, the waters of the great deep, Isaiah 51:10. Well, that hardly sounds like 2.5 million people sloshing through a shallow swamp somewhere. The route specified in Exodus 13:18 would seem to require a crossing site somewhere along the southern shore of the Gulf of Aqaba, with a beach large enough to accommodate the entire nation of Israel, along with their immense herds and flocks. When the Israelites reached the Red Sea, they were instructed by God in Exodus 14:2 to turn back and camp by a place called Pi-hahiroth, which is between Migdol and the Red Sea. It appears that God was laying a trap for Pharaoh. Not only was Moses told to take the way of the wilderness to the Red Sea, but they were also supernaturally guided there by a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. Now they're told to turn back and await the deliverance of the Lord.
It's easy to see how Pharaoh could have considered them trapped. Perhaps the Pharaoh was convinced the Hebrews were in a situation where he couldn't possibly lose, which gave him the courage to tempt God's anger one more time. Perhaps Moses even wondered himself how God would save his people this time. But his faith was unshakable.
Do we want to die out here? No! Or would we be alive in Egypt? Yeah!
Peace! Peace! Still your tongues! Where is your faith? Do you think the Lord brought you out of bondage in Egypt to die on the shores of this sea? Fear not the Egyptians and their chariots. You need do nothing but be still and turn your fears into faith. Then you will see God's power.
Even to some of the most faithful, it must have seemed like Moses had bitten off more than he could chew this time. The Red Sea extends from Ethiopia and Yemen in the south and separates Africa from Arabia in the north. There was no way around it, certainly no way back. And at this particular spot on the Gulf of Aqaba, it certainly seems impassable. But is it? Recent discoveries by some researchers seem to point to a crossing site near the mouth of the Gulf of Aqaba, where the Red Sea is only about 5 miles wide.
In 1988, we retraced the Exodus route from the tip of the Sinai Peninsula into Saudi Arabia, using the Bible and satellite imagery to find the actual route. Inland, 33 kilometers, we found the bitter springs of Marah mentioned in Exodus 15. This dirt sample from the springs has been chemically analyzed and was found to contain excessive iron and dissolved salts, making it very bitter. Continuing along the route, we came to the clear water springs mentioned in Exodus 15:27. Here, caves were being excavated by Saudi archaeologists. They said they had found the writings in these caves indicating that Moses had come through this area.
At this site in 1799, Napoleon's engineers discovered an underwater ridge some 600 feet wide that extended from shore to shore. His engineers calculated the right time for crossing this 5.2-mile strip when the east wind would blow sufficiently to clear the seabed of water. Napoleon, however, barely escaped with his life when a sudden change in the wind's direction brought an onrush of water covering this strip within just a matter of minutes.
Professor Doran Knopf also found this an intriguing sight.
We were intrigued by the possibility that perhaps there is some explanation for a similar process. So what we did, we developed what we call in physical oceanography a mathematical model of the part of the Red Sea where many people believe that crossing could have been. Okay, what we have here now is a physical model of the Red Sea. The deep part supposed to represent the main body of the Red Sea, which is about 2,000 or 3,000 feet deep, and the shallow part, with the one with the sloping bottom, supposed to represent the Gulf, which is much shallower. As we said before, it's about 100 feet deep. In addition to this, we introduced here an artificial ridge, which you see right here, and the depth of the water above that artificial ridge is only about 10 feet high. Okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the wind blow from here, and you will see how the water recedes and in fact exposes the ridge to the air. Okay, so what you can see now is that most of the water, in fact, to the left of the ridge is blown away. There is still some water there, and you see that there is an exposed area right there. All right? So the idea is that the Israelis crossed on this part of the ridge which was exposed, and they saw water on the two sides, right? They saw the water on the left side of the ridge and the water on the right side. And I'm going to cut the wind off now, and I'm going to do that abruptly, and you will see how it comes back. So let's do that. And of course what happens after that is that when the wind relaxes, the water wants to come back to the position that it had before, and it does that via a gravity wave, which moves at the speed we calculated to be like 15 feet per second or so, which is of course a speed that one cannot escape.
Is that the answer? Have oceanographers established how and where the crossing took place?
Ocean bottom charts show that the Gulf of Aqaba is a steep trench or V-shaped canyon about 5,000 feet deep that would be impassable for anyone from either side. At a steep slope of 45 degrees, it would be impassable even if it were not already filled with the waters of the Red Sea. However, there is an anomaly at the Nuweiba beach about halfway down the Gulf of Aqaba where a sand bridge spans the steep slope about 2,700 feet wide and 8 miles long that people could walk across.
If there was an actual exodus of the enslaved Israelites out of Egypt and a miraculous crossing of the Red Sea, shouldn't at least some of the details of the story be verifiable? What is there about this site that has suddenly made it so interesting?
One thing is the geographical setting. Here we have a huge beach large enough to accommodate 2 million people with their flocks and herds, and its only entrance is through a narrow canyon. The Pharaoh would certainly believe that he had the Israelites trapped, as Exodus 14:3 says they were entangled in the wilderness. The most impressive part of the whole geography is the land bridge at the south end of the beach. And the fact that this land bridge is nearly 3,000 feet wide adds new dimension to the statistical possibilities. Using the lowest possible estimate for 600,000 men under arms, including their women and children, there would be more than 2 million people. If you were to put these people across a modern 4-lane highway, the line of march would stretch more than 150 miles.
Actually, when you crunch the numbers, it doesn't come out that way. Since the underwater land bridge we discovered at the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula is 1.5 miles wide, and you allow 5 feet per person, side by side, that puts 1,500 people abreast. And with the length of the crossing site being 2.5 miles long, and assuming a foot speed of 2.5 miles per hour, the total crossing time for these 2.5 million people, plus their animals, would be approximately 4 hours.
Statistically, then, it appears to have been possible, but is there any evidence, any physical evidence, that suggests this was the crossing site?
Researchers have been diving off the Nuweiba beach since 1978 and have found chariot wheels, chariot parts, and other artifacts on the seabed's land bridge. In Exodus, it says that God made the chariot wheels to come off the Egyptian chariots. There are skeletal remains and chariot wheels, even one gold-plated chariot wheel, which indicates that even the highest officials of the land were involved, just as the Bible indicates.
And there's one more startling find. 2 identical Phoenician-style columns, one on either side of the crossing site. Some scholars have speculated the columns were erected by Solomon in commemoration of the crossing miracle. Does this prove once and for all the validity of the biblical account of the Exodus and the parting of the Red Sea? Certainly not all critics would agree, but persistent scientific and archaeological research seems to be bringing us closer to an explanation and a verifiable site. Perhaps it will be a whole new generation of brilliant young researchers, theologians, and scientists that will finally solve this mystery. And perhaps some of them are among us now.